Okay, we are ready to start. Thank you all for coming. Our today's task is to promote the second edition of Yanis' almost bestseller book called The Global Minotaur. Unfortunately, we don't have enough books here to distribute or to sell, but if you will be satisfied with our talk, you can, of course, buy it in different ways, or even you can find maybe some illegal copies, something like that. So
I can send you an illegal copy to you.
yeah, also, but I think there's only the illegal copy of the first edition on the web, and I'm not sure for the second. I think that most of you were also yesterday on the Yanis lecture, and that you're all mostly familiar. Do you know who he is? He's, of course, just to repeat it briefly, Yanis is a Greek economist, and that was important that he was a Greek economist during the crisis, not just an economist. And now he's teaching at the University of Texas in Austin. So we will start with the book. So in the book, Yanis somehow presented this historical, geopolitical, economical narrative of the development of the post-war 20th century global capitalism. So let's start there. As you said yesterday, the Second World War was a solution to the Great Depression, to the crisis of the 30s. So we are in a situation, 1945, the end of the war. The U.S. is the only surplus nation, and then what happens in the sense of development of the world capitalism with the leading position of the United States, and also the devastation of Europe, and also other parts of the world, the power of the Soviet Union. So what happened in 1945 concerning Bretton Woods and the later development in terms of what you call what was the global plan for the global economy in the 1945 after the war?
Well, let me before I answer your question, let me say what the purpose of the book was. It was not to write a historical treatise. It was to answer a very simple question. A question that tortures most of us. Why is our world in the crisis that it finds itself in? Why did the crash of 2008 happen? And why is recovery nowhere to be seen at a global level? And instead what we have is a constant spreading of the crisis while it is evolving and transforming and mutating. That was the purpose of the book. And in trying to answer that, effectively what I'm saying is that in 2008, we had the breakdown, the implosion, the collapse of the second post-war phase of American hegemony. The post-war had two phases. One was the Bretton Woods, the global plan era, what I call the global plan. It started in 1944-45 and crashed and burned in 1971 with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Then there was a second period, which I call the Global Minotaur. And this was a metaphor that crept up on me at some point, because I needed to give this second American hegemonical phase from 1971 to 2008 a name. So, being Greek, I dug into the archives of Greek mythology, and I came up with a metaphor, an allegory, which I think was apt. So let me ask the question. What was the first phase after the Second World War of American hegemony? It was a global plan. Most of us remember it as the Bretton Woods system, but it was more than the Bretton Woods system. This is why I use a more general term, the global plan. In a few brushstrokes, let me explain what that era entailed. We had a fixed currency in the Western world, effectively a fixed currency. The dollar was linked to gold, and it could be converted, it was convertible to gold at 1 ounce of gold for $35 constantly throughout that period. And every other currency was linked to the dollar again at a fixed exchange rate. It could be negotiated, and occasionally it was changed, that exchange rate, but for very long periods of time, these exchange rates remained fixed. So it was effectively as if capitalism had the same currency, like a kind of gold standard. But that was not all. It was not just that Bretton Woods system. There was something else. What the Americans had learned, the New Dealers, the successors of the Roosevelt administration, what they had learned, to their great detriment, from the collapse of the gold standard of the mid-war period, was that if you have a gold standard, if you have a fixed currency, binding together disparate capitalist economies, some of them being deficit economies, some being surplus economies, some being heavily oligopolized and industrialized, others being more rural, like Greece, which was part of that Bretton Woods system, and the gold standard. What happens is, there is a period of growth mediated by the common currency, the commonality of the currency, the stability that that common currency gives rise to, that creates a period of growth, which creates bubbles, which then burst, especially financial bubbles, which is what happened in 1929. And then when that financial crisis turns into a real economic crisis, factories closing down, you've seen Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin, right? Then what happens is the burden of adjusting to this new reality falls disproportionately on the deficit countries, on the deficit regions, not just the deficit countries. And then, because the burden of adjustment falls disproportionately on the deficit countries have to go into austerity, into cutbacks. And these cutbacks feed further into the collapse in economic activity, and that is a debt deflationary cycle, which eventually causes rupture in the whole system, and the countries or the regions that are in surplus and which can cut themselves off from that common currency do so, like Britain in 1931 removed itself from the gold standard, then soon after that the United States, and then the whole system fragments. And when it crashes, then society finds itself in a Great Depression. Now, the Americans knew that, because all the designers, the New Deal designers, who happened to be in government in Washington in 1944, 45, 46, had all experienced personally the immense costs, social costs of the Great Depression. And they were determined that the second version of the gold standard, the Bretton Woods system that they were creating after the war, would not suffer from that fate. So what did they do to avert it? They added to that fixed currency system something that was missing in the mid-war period. And I call that a surplus recycling mechanism. Remember, you have the deficit regions or countries and you have the surplus ones. So the idea is to create shock absorbers so that if there is a crisis, not all the burden of the adjustments of the crisis goes onto the deficit areas. To ensure that that wouldn't happen, the Americans were determined to take surpluses from the surplus regions and transfer them constantly to the deficit regions in order to bolster in the deficit regions the demand for the goods and the net exports and the surpluses of the surplus regions, therefore closing the loop and creating a sustainable recycling system, something that capitalism, based on markets alone, cannot do. This is what the New Dealers understood. Now, what was the surplus recycling mechanism of the global plan area? It was very simple. The Americans, the American administration, beginning with the Marshall Plan, but that was just one example of many, which I won't bother you with now, effectively, for the first 15 years of that global plan, from 1949 to 1964, took 70% of American profits, of American surpluses, and recycled them in Germany, in France, in the rest of Europe, and in Japan. Not out of philanthropy, but because they were enlightened, selfish policymakers, combination of enlightenment and selfishness, who understood that it was in the interest of American corporations that the Germans and the French and the Japanese have the capacity to purchase their cars and their refrigerators and their fighter planes, to add another dimension to it. That system worked perfectly well from the perspective of these policymakers, in the sense that capitalism had its golden era during those years. Capitalism was experiencing steady, zero inflation, very low unemployment growth that gave rise to the generation of a certain class of people who took it for granted that every year would be better than the previous year, something that could never have been taken for granted before under capitalism. But that global plan system was bound to die out. Why? Because by the end of the 1960s, the United States of America had no surpluses anymore to recycle. And that is why in 1971, on the 15th of August, Richard Nixon, the president then, declared the death of the Bretton Woods system and the beginning of a new era, which I call the Global Minotaur.
So what was the reaction of the American administration, policymakers to this new situation? Expecting that now the Germans and the Japanese somehow started to produce surplus in relation to the United States, and also what was their now solution to this geopolitical economic situation, and also can you explain what was the role, as you were mentioning in the roundtable and the lecture, what was the role of the American administration in constructing the European Union, and how this process of European community building up went in what direction after the crisis of the early 70s? Because it's really, I think it's important to talk about this, especially in this context when Croatia entering the European Union in 2 months.
Sure. From 1946, if you read in the archives of the US Congress, that the positions by very interesting people, like Dean Acheson, for example, you will see that it was part of the global plan, an intentional plan, well before it was instituted, that Germany and Japan would be surplus countries, together with the United States of America. But they would be surplus countries within their own backyards. That's how the Americans referred to it. The Germans might have referred to it as vital space. So it was an intentional policy of Washington from 44, 45 onwards to create markets surrounding these center of capitalist industrial activity in Germany and Japan, vital spaces around them, that would be in deficit vis-à-vis Germany and vis-à-vis Japan. In Europe, it was the European Union. It was always a part of the American architectural design for the post-war era that Europe should unite, it should create a free trade zone, with Germany being the net exporter to the rest, and the rest providing Germany what German factories did not have, which was effective demand for their net exports. The way they did it was by banging heads together, French and German ones initially, by convincing the French, it wasn't an easy task, to accept the premise that Germany would be allowed to reindustrialize or not to deindustrialize, and that in exchange for German dominance of the new institutions like the OECD and Brussels later on, Germany should become the net surplus producer of industrial goods primarily. They had a similar plan for Japan. The hinterland for Japan would be China. But Mao Zedong made sure that that plan crashed and burned very early. And it's remarkable how the American policymakers responded to this setback, let's call it. They decided, since Japan cannot have a hinterland, unlike Germany, that had Southern Europe, that had France, that had the rest of the what became the European Union, they decided, okay, well, we'll be their hinterland. Have you ever wondered why it was that they allowed their own car industry effectively to be destroyed through the importation of Toyotas and Mazdas and Hondas? The Americans don't have any qualm about imposing tariffs and quotas, but they didn't with the Japanese industry. Well, no, because it was part of the global plan that Japan would be providing a pillar for this global plan through a strong currency, the yen, which would be supported by a strong industry. So it was not just that America would have surpluses. There were in their estimation, there would be one large pillar, which would be the dollar zone, and then there would be a yen zone and a Deutschmark zone. The yen and the Deutschmark zones will be supported by surplus industrial sectors in these two countries, whose goods would be eaten up, gobbled up by vital spaces surrounding them, while the American corporations would retain, especially through the dominance and the exorbitant privilege of having the reserve currency of the world, the dollar, and the globalization of American business, especially oil companies and the defense industry, they would maintain a global surplus position vis-à-vis the rest of the world.
And now the architecture of the Global Minotaur as a reaction to the changed circumstances. Just before you start there, do you think now you're somehow interpreting the crisis of the early 70s just in terms of these imbalances that happened through this plan? Do you think that this crisis is usually elaborated in Marxist perspective? It has something to do with the inherent logic of capitalism, be it tendency of the rate of the profit to fall, be it profit squeeze, these kind of theories, or you think it is mostly concerned with the way how the Americans constructed the geopolitical relations, and not so much, and it's not effect of this inherent contradictions capitalism as such?
Come to think of it, what the global plan was, from the New Dealers' perspective, was an intentional attempt to counter Marx's falling rate of profit at a global scale. It was an attempt to go beyond the market, to introduce extra market interventions in the global capitalist economy in order to ameliorate for what Marx described as the endemic crisis dynamic of capitalism and the falling rate of profit. By recycling profits from the United States to Europe and to Japan, and then within Europe and even within Japan, between different sectors, between the industrial sector and the agricultural sector in Japan, and through national economic planning that they allowed for and even encouraged, almost Soviet Gosplan planning in Japan, American New Dealer policymakers were trying to prove to Marx, it was as if they were not trying, but it was as if they were trying to prove to Marxists that they can actually plan capitalism in a way that prevents the falling rate of profit from undermining it. And for a while they managed it. But the only way of understanding the collapse of the welfare state and the shift to neoliberalism is through a Marxist perspective, because what happened was these attempts by American policymakers effectively failed in the end. Within the United States of America, the Great Society program of LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, together with the Vietnam War, was undermining the capacity of the global plan to continue functioning because it was destroying the surpluses. At the same time, American corporations, partly also due to their globalization, were increasing the rate of falling profits within the United States, creating a profit squeeze. There's no way you can understand the collapse of the social democratic consensus, the Bevanite consensus in Britain, until we see it from a Marxist perspective, that the profit rate had effectively turned negative in the United Kingdom. But in the context of my story, what happened was at some point, this attempt institutionally and through a global economic plan to manage capitalist crisis, or the tendency of global capitalism towards crisis, at some point they realized they couldn't do it anymore. But what was fascinating to me, or will always be fascinating to me, is the reaction of Washington policymakers in 1970, 71, 72, when they, before anybody else, could see the writing on the wall that the global plan that they had created was dead in the water. Now, let me ask you a question. Suppose that German policymakers found out that Germany was shifting from a surplus position to a deficit position. What do you think Germany would do? I think they would go straight for austerity. They would go straight for cutting budgets, trying to affect monetary and fiscal policy in such a way as to reduce trade deficit, budget deficits, all deficits. Effectively, their economy would shrink, like the European economy is shrinking now, as a result of this mindset. What did the Americans do? When they realized that they have a deficit situation now, which was actually growing, they did something absolutely astonishingly remarkable. They decided that the solution to the deficit problem is to enhance their deficits, to make them grow, and to make them grow at an increasing rate. Now, that is an astonishing conception. And how am I backing up this story? Well, Paul Volcker was a young man who worked for Henry Kissinger before Henry Kissinger became the foreign minister, Secretary of State for the United States, when he was still National Security Advisor. And Volcker was working for him, and Kissinger asked Volcker, who was a young banker, to come up with an idea as to how could American hegemony be expanded when the deficit is increasing. And Volcker wrote a 3-page report, which actually I've read. It was very difficult to get, and you cannot find it anywhere, even on the internet. I have it in a manuscript form that was given to me by a friend in America some time ago, which is perhaps the most remarkable statement of the 20th century. Oh, well, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. In it, he said, well, if we can't remain hegemonic, that's the word he used. Huh? No, that's not a left-wing text, it's Volcker. If we can't remain hegemonic by handling, was the word he used, our surpluses, we should do it by handling other people's surpluses. And that's the Global Minotaur. Effectively, what America did was to say, okay, well, we don't have a surplus anymore, so we can't recycle it, but we can recycle everybody else's surpluses and retain our hegemonical position through that. And this is the very first time in human economic history, or history in general, that an empire is expanding its realm and its power and its strength and vitality by expanding its deficits. Usually, when an empire enters into deficit, it's the beginning of its decline. Not in the case of the United States. So that is what I'm trying to do. This is the story of the book. How did they conceptualize and how did they implement and how did they effect so successfully for so long, between the early 1970s and 2008, a policy of enhancing their hegemony, of creating a very dynamic global capitalism with enormous imbalances, inequities, and human tragedies, by expanding their deficits and having other people paying for them. Because that's what recycling other people's deficits means, surpluses means.
So before we come to the current crisis, just can you elaborate a little bit, because you are mentioning in a book, the effects of the Volcker shock that had on the Eastern Bloc, especially Yugoslavia and Poland, and the debt crisis, how this crisis is also connected with the debt crisis of the Third World. Because also, as I mentioned, because the question of the European Union, because it is interesting here to analyze the process of disintegration of the Eastern Bloc from this perspective of its involvement in the global market, because that kind of elaborations and narrative are not so. It's funny, but they are not so known here. There is no way that you can find this kind of articulation of the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc from that perspective. And I think it's very important to hear that also story as a crucial part of this process.
In the United States, there is Ronald Reagan worship, which is quite obscene, because the man did not deserve even to be in a footnote of history. But nevertheless, the Americans believe that he won the Cold War. That through his expenditure on missiles and Star Wars systems, he pushed the Soviet side to its extremes, and that's what led the Soviet bloc, the Eastern European bloc, to implode. If I had to name one person in the United States who was responsible for undermining the socialist bloc I would use the same name that I used before, Paul Volcker.
You really like to quote him in the book.
I do. I think this guy's a hero. Not a hero, but a villain if you want, but a major player. This same young man who wrote this document in 1971 for Henry Kissinger was appointed in 1978 by Jimmy Carter, the Democratic side, to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. And in an attempt to implement or help implement the plan that he had himself scripted 7 years later, he pushed interest rates up from 2.5% to 20%. Now that is the largest increase in interest rates in an industrial society ever. Before that had happened, countries like Yugoslavia, Poland, as well as many African and Asian countries, that had managed to pull themselves up from the bootstraps after the Second World War, and in the case of Africa, out of the national liberation struggles against colonialism. They were setting up their states, they were hungry for infrastructural investments. During the period of the Bretton Woods or the Global Plan period, American banks, British banks, German banks were very highly regulated, as they ought to be, because of the New Dealers regulations that were introduced from 1933 onwards. So their margins for profiteering were very low. But when suddenly you have the Yugoslav economic miracle, because that's what it was in the 1950s and 60s, not according to Yugoslavs, but according to bourgeois economists in the West. I have friends who recall debating the Yugoslav economic miracle at Harvard University or the LSE and so on and so forth. What was a miracle from the perspective of bankers? It was just a very high growth rate. And an opportunity to come to Yugoslavia, to go to Poland in the early 1970s, before the Bretton Woods system collapsed completely, to go to Africa and lend their surplus cash, which they couldn't lend at any rate that they wanted in America because they were very heavily regulated by the FDIC, the Fed, and so on and so forth. When those interest rates were pushed up to 20% by Paul Volcker, effectively that destroyed the non-aligned movement and the Soviet bloc in one very simple move. No missile, no Star Wars program was as effective in corroding from within the economic dynamism of countries like Yugoslavia and the Third World than that crisis, which became, as we all know, and Susan George has explicitly and very well described later, as a fate worse than death.
So I will have one more question, then we open the questions for the audience. Okay, in this historical trajectory, now we come to the it's called epilogue till now, the current crisis. And do you still think that your metaphor of global minotaur still works after the 5 years of the crisis? And also, just can you explain a little bit this trajectory of how there's lots of explanations how it took so long, 30 years, to postpone the inevitable crisis of the 70s, to postpone it in the sense that it lasted, that the collapse just came 30 years after it. And also the question how the euro crisis was connected with this global mechanisms of producing crisis, and what was the specificity of the euro crisis because of its monetary structure and stuff. So I think, just to finish this historical way, and then of course audience can ask what they want, but maybe we can then debate about these political economic solutions.
Now, very briefly, what happened with after the early 1970s, this plan by people like Volcker, but not just Volcker, to expand American hegemony by expanding the deficits, was based on a very similar idea: the reversal of what was happening under the Global Plan. So under the Global Plan, America, especially after the Second World War, was a surplus country. It was the only serious surplus country around the world. All the others were in ashes, right? And their idea was that they would recycle their surpluses to Europe and to Asia to create demand for American goods in order to perpetuate the surplus position of the American state, the American economy. When that died in 1971, they reversed that. So what happened was this. America operated like a huge vacuum cleaner. It was sucking into the American economy the exports of the German factories, of the Japanese factories, and later of the Chinese factories. The German, Japanese, and Chinese capitalists were accumulating profits from these net exports. But, and that was the brilliance of the Volcker plan, the idea was to create the circumstances in Wall Street such that the German, Chinese, Saudi, Russian later profits would voluntarily stream into Wall Street because they would get better returns there, therefore closing the loop and financing the American deficits. What was not intended by Volcker, and Volcker was exceptionally critical of the Reagan administration and Greenspan who took over from him, was that they did not see the effect of financialization in destroying this system. So the tsunami of capital that was coming from the rest of the world to Wall Street allowed Wall Street bankers to leverage this money up. If you give, it was about between $3 and $5 billion a day net that was flowing into Wall Street on average during those 30 years. 3 to 5 billion net a day. That is a lot of money. If you give those billions to bankers for a few minutes every day, not hours, I bet you, trust me, they will find ways of making it multiply. This was financialization. You get $1, and through lending it a million different times, especially when you devise the process of securitization and toxic derivatives, you make that, take $1 and you make it 100. This financialization, it was put it very simply, it was like giving a license to Wall Street to print their own private money on the back of the tsunami of capital that was coming in from the rest of the world. This financialization led from, let's take just 2 points in time. In 2000, for every dollar that was issued by the Fed, financialization in Wall Street and the City of London was creating $100. By 2007, for every dollar that was issued by the Fed, financialization was producing $1.2 million. So it was like, you know, the planet was not big enough for these huge pyramids of toxic money. And like all pyramids, you know, their fate at some point involves a collapse. They collapse under their own hubris. When that happened, and this is what happened in 2008, that recycling mechanism simply broke down. Now, you asked me about what has been happening since 2008. In 2008, 2009, American demand for German, Japanese, and Chinese exports fell by 45%. Right? Within 2 years, because of Ben Bernanke's policies in the Fed of effectively pumping trillions in order to refloat the bubble of the financial system, the trade deficit, the budget deficit of the United States increased even beyond what it was before 2008. However, if you look at trade data, you will see that American demand for German goods is 25% down today compared to 2007. For Chinese goods, 30% less. For Japanese goods, 60% less. That gives you an idea as to why you have this crisis of realization in Marxist terms at the global level, why you have recessionary forces, recessionary winds blowing all over the planet. The European Union, and in particular the Eurozone, was a construct which was predicated upon the continuation of that recycling mechanism. The way we create, what did we do in Europe really? We created a gold standard by creating the Eurozone, a fixed currency amongst our countries without a surplus recycling mechanism within us. what happened in the 1930s, therefore, was bound to happen in the Eurozone the moment a large-scale financial crisis happened, just like it happened in 1929. The New Dealers knew that. So the New Dealers always believed that if you are to create a fixed currency, you need to add to it a surplus recycling mechanism. Europe didn't. Europe repeated the mistake of the 20s of creating a gold standard in Europe, the Euro standard, without the surplus recycling mechanism. Now, that was fine while the American deficits and Wall Street financialization were creating demand for the net exports of the surplus countries within the Eurozone, because that demand created profits. Part of those profits, 70%, ran back to Wall Street to satiate the global minotaur, as I say. But 30% of these German profits were going to the European periphery, to Greece, to Ireland, to Spain, creating bubbles there that were maintaining demand for Mercedes-Benzes and therefore closing the circle. But the moment that the American economy's capacity to recycle other people's surpluses crashed and burned in 2008, that vessel that we call the Eurozone was bound to go through a process of disintegration like that of the gold standard in the 1920s and 30s. Why? Because the gold standard and the Euro standard have one thing in common. They do not contain shock absorbers. They don't contain the surplus recycling mechanism, which the New Dealers knew was essential, and which Paul Volcker knew to be essential too.
Okay, now I'd like to open the floor for the questions. Just, when we were talking to Srečko a year ago about inviting you here, we were planning to do it in combination with another Greek economist, Kostas Lapavitsis, to stage this ultimate debate on the Greek solution, but Kostas couldn't come. But I know there are here a few people who would like to play the role of Kostas, so please, there are two questions. Tony and another one. There is the mic.
Right, so imminent critique, let's start with what you said. Gold standard in Eurozone is repetition of the tiers in 20s and 30s gold standard in US, and the only way to make it happen, to make us overcome those tiers is shock absorbers, so what you call the surplus recycling. Now, can you tell us once more what you said yesterday? What is the plausibility of criteria upon which you base your economic analysis and political decision to stick with euro for Greece? Not just for Greece, but for other countries, because I think that your criteria rests on the hope that we will have shock absorbers created within the Eurozone, that is more plausible in some medium term, let's say, not short term, rather than exiting, going for our own currency, and then perhaps this is the scenario you told us yesterday, that other southern countries would exit Eurozone, which I think if we take those southern countries, perhaps might be talking to each other to create a different currency, or at least a clearing bank like we had in 1950 created in what we know as Eurozone now. Would that not scenario at least have certain plausibility that is better in midterm than expecting shock absorbers to be created in the Eurozone?
My answer will come in 3 points, in three parts. Firstly, forget Greece for just 1 second. If the Eurozone collapses, we are all going to be embroiled in a postmodern 1930s. If the Eurozone crashes and burns, I personally campaigned against the Euro in the 1990s, but we created it. So there are irreversibilities. If we give up the Euro, we are not going to back to where we would have been if we didn't have it. So it's one thing to say we shouldn't have it, it's quite another to say we should get out of it, right? And if the Euro, the way that it was constructed, and the way that financialization proceeded during the golden age, those 8 years, pretty good years of the Euro, and then crashed and burned and all that after that, with that history behind us, if now the Euro goes, we're going to have a massive depression in Germany and stagflation in the rest of Europe. The global economy will not be able to take that shock. China is going to go into reverse. Brazil is going to see all the improvements in poverty rates and so on go to smithereens. And therefore, the global economy is going to be detrimentally affected if the Eurozone goes. That's from an internationalist perspective. Now, let me speak from a Greek perspective. What we have done, what the Greek state has done, what the successive 3 different governments have done since the debt crisis, the debt exploded in early 2010, was a crime against humanity. So I don't defend the fact that we stayed in the euro following the prescriptions that were coming to us by Brussels and Frankfurt and so on. My proposal was that Greece should simply announce that it is defaulting, just like Argentina did, within the euro in January 2010, and stick the finger to Germany and say, well, you can now solve this problem by yourself, right? Why was I not supporting the idea that we should make an announcement that we are returning to the drachma? In other words, why am I buying half of the Argentinian strategy, but not the other half? Yes to the default, no to creating our own currency. Well, because Argentina had the peso. It had a currency that it could devalue. It had a peg, 1-to-1 between the peso and the US dollar, but it had the peso. Argentinians had the peso in their pockets. They had, the banks were stuffed with pesos. The ATMs would give you pesos. And it was simply a matter of saying, well, from now on, we devalue it. But when you don't have a currency, you can't devalue it. All you can do is you can announce that, you know, in 8 months, we are going to have a currency, which, by the way, we're going to devalue. Now, this, can you imagine a preemptive announcement of a devaluation 8 months before it happens? This is a recipe. It's a recipe for having all wealth liquidated and leave the country. Unless then, of course, we have armed guards at the borders to stop people from taking their money out. But that would mean that we have to get out of the European Union. And don't forget that Greece doesn't have something else that Argentina had. Argentina, at the moment when it was defaulting and sticking the finger to the IMF, which I really applaud them for, and I love them for it, okay? They had large tracts of land capable of producing millions of tons of soya beans that China wanted to buy at that moment. Greece doesn't have anything of the sort. So if given that we didn't have a ready-made export market, and we didn't have a currency to devalue, it would be suicidal to get out of the drachma. What we should do is create circumstances, plan B. We should start the process of thinking of creating a currency in case we need it, not just because we may choose to leave the euro, but because the euro may not exist after a while, if Germany leaves. Because that is more likely for me, as far as I'm concerned, that Germany would depart from the euro. Okay? Now, just to finish off, I don't have a dogmatic position on whether one should leave the euro or not. For me, it's a question of cost and benefits of human suffering. It's very simple. Cyprus, this is what I'm going to go next week to Nicosia to argue, should get out of the euro today. Because they're already out of the euro. They've already suffered the cost of exiting. They have capital controls, they have a destroyed banking system. Why have the Troika visits as well on top of that? But Greece has not had that yet. So I think that from an internationalist and a Greek perspective and a European perspective, the most effective radical policy would be for a Greek government to rise up, or a Greek prime minister or minister of finance, to rise up in ECOFIN, in the Eurogroup, wherever, and say, folks, we are defaulting. We shall not be repaying next May the 6 billion that supposedly we owe the European Central Bank. My God, you know, to have a destroyed economy which is borrowing from the European Stability Mechanism to pay to the European Central Bank is not just idiotic, but it's the epitome of misanthropy. Say no to that. But why step out? Put them in front of their contradictions. Make them face the contradictions of the Eurozone themselves. Because the moment the Greek Prime Minister declares default within the Eurozone, all hell will break loose. And either they will have to introduce those shock absorbers, or the euro will die anyway. And then we can go to the drachma.
Another question.
This is going to be a bit symbolic question. If we can go back to Greek mythology, we all know that Minotaur, the original one, was put in, was controlled by a labyrinth, by a maze. The Minotaur you spoke about is quite the opposite, is building his own labyrinth around the rest of the world. Who do you see, not persons, but or do you see the Daedalus and Icarus, the regional constructors of the labyrinth today, or is it possible in any way to say it in this term?
Well, we shouldn't take metaphors too far. We should, but we should beware that our analytical capacity may be waning the more we delve into our metaphors. But let me say this, the equivalent between the labyrinth and the Minotaur in mythological Crete and the United States, that parallelism, I still like it because, let's think about it, in the United States of America, there were very few people who celebrated the deficit, the trade deficit of the United States, or the budget deficit. All of them were saying, they were making proclamations, especially before elections, that they want to reduce them, they want to eliminate the budget deficit. They still do. They don't mean it, of course, right? So the budget deficit and the trade deficit, which was the Minotaur, the Global Minotaur, effectively, living in the labyrinth of the American political establishment, was a despised beast, even in the United States. They despised their deficits, and yet those deficits were instrumental in maintaining their hegemony. Similarly, according to myth, the Minotaur, which was a despised myth, it was a result of incest, the son of the queen, something that a terrible, horrible secret that nobody spoke about upstairs in the palace. And yet it was essential for maintaining the Pax Cretana. So that, there. Now, about Icarus and Daedalus, I don't want to go further. That would be taking the metaphor a bit too far, I think.
So we have time for one or two more questions. Here.
It's coming.
Thanks. There was a similar book, although I must confess I didn't read it. Neither I did read your book, but I will read this summer both of them. Similar book, but from different perspective. It was written, probably know, by David Stockman.
By whom?
David Stockman.
Stockman, yeah.
He was a budget manager, budget director during the Reagan administration for first mandate and 3 years, and then he resigned. His book is called The Great Deformation. It's now hit in America, and I think it touches the same topic, maybe from different perspective. He's more on Austrian perspective, but you know how Austrians are critical on this subject of deficit and what they think of it. I don't know whether you read the book, but it would be interesting to hear your opinion, how these ideas from different perspectives now have found the point of similarity. And the second, what I wanted to just to mention, or maybe ask you about Greek default. As I know, as I'm aware, Greek already defaulted twice in the last 2 years. And Greek paid 35% to institutional investors and 28% only to private investors for the debt of 150 billion euros. It's much. It's already semi-default, isn't it? Yeah. Okay.
Right. Regarding the first point, this is what happens at times of crisis. You make some very strange bedfellows. Or you actually find yourself to be in agreement with people that you never imagined you would be in agreement with. So with many people in the Austrian tradition, for instance, they would agree completely and entirely with my argument that Greece should have defaulted immediately, right? Similarly, they have interesting stories. I don't know this book, but I have read similar texts, and I find a great deal of commonality with lots of, neoliberal Republicans in the United States who also find commonality with what I am saying. But let me go straight to the second point, because for those of us of a certain Greek disposition, it's something that really hurts. It's something that we really want to talk about. Now, my argument was that Greece should have defaulted before it entered into negotiations or as a preamble to any negotiations with European Union partners, and especially with the Troika and the IMF. You declare default, and then you invite both representatives of finance, international finance, and your European Union partners, say, okay, now, are there any ideas as to how we can minimize the costs to the international banks and to the local banks from our default? Come to us with our suggestion. We didn't do that. We went cap in hand to Germany and said, give us money so that we don't default. And at first they said no. They waited for months. The problem was getting worse because everybody could see that the default could not be averted. The Greek economy for 4 months died, negative investment, making the debt worse, and the capacity, eroding the capacity of the Greek economy to repay it. And then when they gave us the bailout, it wasn't the bailout. What it was they transferred effectively a large chunk of banking losses from Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, Greek banks, onto the shoulders of the Greek taxpayer and, of course, the European taxpayer, because the shoulders of the European taxpayer was clear, they wouldn't be able to bear it. So, yes, there was a default, but it happened a year after the bailout loans were given. Effectively, that transfer of losses from the banking sector to the taxpayer happened first. Greece was indebted to the German taxpayer. And then the default that happened was too little, too late, and it affected effectively only the Greek banking sector, the Greek pension funds, and Greek citizens who had purchased some bonds, for their old age. So when you prevent a default from happening, you delay it, while transferring a large chunk of the debt to the official sector, and the official sector says, but that is not going to be defaulted upon. What you do is you create another period of 1 year of negative investment, because everybody knows that this is not a sustainable situation. So you have another year of negative investment, of collapsing GDP, collapsing economic activity, and then when the default comes, it doesn't help. It's not cathartic, to use another Greek word. Like a default in January 2010 would have been cathartic. If we had, like in Iceland, you have a short, sharp shock. After a while, financial markets start lending you again, because you don't owe anything anymore. So with tabula rasa, we start again. But we managed to default and retain an unsustainable debt. Only this time it was the debt to the ECB that does not accept any haircuts. Think about it. I mentioned that before, the case of the May bond maturity, the bond that is maturing now in May. The ECB, in its infinite wisdom, at the time of the Greek bailout, decided to step into the bond markets and purchase Greek, Italian, Irish, and Portuguese bonds, and some Spanish bonds, in order to create a little bit of demand that would keep the interest rates that these countries are paying relatively low in order to stop them from collapsing. Of course, Mr. Trichet, the worst central banker to have walked on this planet, announced that the ECB would not be spending more than 200 billion. So this was like inviting bond traders to place bets against the ECB's success with a limited budget. The only way of doing this is to say, we're going to burn you however much money you bet against Greek bonds or Italian bonds, we will burn you. Then they don't dare do it. But if you already say what is your own limit, how much ammunition you're allowed to use, then of course they will have more ammunition than you as a central banker. So, just to give you this example. Right? So, they bought Greek bonds. One of these bonds expires now, matures now. Face value, 6 billion. How much did the ECB purchase these bonds for? 4 billion. Because they purchased them at a serious discount, because bondholders that owned them back then, in 2010, 2011, wanted to get rid of them, so they sold them cheap. So the Greek government now, which is bankrupt, will have to go to the European taxpayers and borrow 6 billion to give to the ECB, right? So the ECB can make a profit of 2 billion from a bankrupt member state of the Eurozone. Now, this would not have happened if we had defaulted in January of 2010. So the default that happened was a non-gift. It was part of the problem, not part of the solution. Because if you delay the default and you end up after the default with debts that everybody knows you can't service, it's a fate worse than death.
So we have time for one short question here.
In one text you wrote, the headline, the abstract was Europe needs hegemonic Germany. Did you think about Germany as powerful country in positive sense, or you thought about some Europe version of USA in terms of all political crimes that were made through the history?
Certainly not the latter. Right? No, what I meant was this. The major surplus country in Europe is Germany. Just like in 1944, the major surplus country in global capitalist terms was the United States. The United States designed, as I was saying before, a common currency, the Bretton Woods system. And because they were genuine hegemons who understood that there is a difference between hegemony on the one hand and authoritarianism on the other. A true hegemon provides to his or her subjects that which is necessary to keep them alive so that he can remain a hegemon. The idiot takes everything away from the peasants and then they starve and then they don't produce another harvest. So what I was saying is, if they want to save the euro, they have to appropriate a hegemonical position, which is not the same thing as an authoritarian position, an idiotically authoritarian position, which undermines their own interests. So I'm accusing Germany not of being unfair, but of being stupid.
Okay, thank you, Yanis. Please applause now. And now in the main hall you can watch another Greek guy, and at 9 another one. So.